Hello and welcome to this version of our notes. Today we're going to be talking about properties of matter. First off, we're going to need to remember that physical properties are properties that can be measured without changing the substance composition, and you can read those examples. Chemical properties can only be observed when a substance undergoes a chemical change. For example, what are some of our words like toxicity, reactivity, corrosiveness, electronegativity? Some of these, burning, rotting, some of these we can only see during a chemical change, so that's what makes it a chemical property. Here are our definitions again of a physical change and a chemical change. Just remember, both of them can be changed back. So how do we tell the difference? A physical change changes the appearance, but the substance is still the same substance, while a chemical change changes it into a completely different substance. Intensive properties are properties that are independent of mass. For example, how much of a substance is present. For example, when we looked at the sand, actually let's look at the iron. When we looked at the iron, if we had one little grain of iron, the color of it was black. That's an intensive property. It was independent of mass. An extensive property would be dependent upon mass. An example of that would be the mass of the iron. If we were to measure the mass of the iron, how much iron we had would determine the mass of it. Most properties are going to be intensive, are going to be independent. For example, you can look through the list. Please take a note of our vocabulary words that we've been working on, but also note some an addition, like luster. But notice that malleability is there, density, conductivity, ductility, malleability, and hardness. Extensive properties: mass, the volume is, remember, extensive is dependent upon mass, so mass is dependent upon mass. Volume is dependent upon how much you have, and length is dependent upon how much you have. Now, some of the properties we labeled as intensive can also be labeled as physical properties. They do not change. Can be labeled as a physical property. We can observe them just by looking at the substance. Odor, texture, color, solubility, mass, volume, density, ductility, malleability, and luster. Some chemical properties, remember, can only be observed during a chemical reaction. So how reactive a substance can only be known when we see the substance reacting. Reactivity, oxidation, fermenting, tarnishing, toxicity, pH, and conductivity. So we're going to review these real quick. Density. Remember the question, what is matter? Well, and we said matter is, okay, you have to say it. Well, density describes that definition almost perfectly, because it describes how much mass is in an object per given unit of space. So, fancy way to describe density is how much mass is in a specific space, or another way to think of it is how close are the particles in a substance packed together. And here are some examples. Lead is one of the most dense substances on the earth, and paraffin wax is not very dense at all. If you're going to calculate density, this is our first equation we're going to be practicing. Density equals calculating density. Density is found by dividing the mass of a substance by its volume. This equation can be found on your equation sheet. So some properties of solids. We've talked about the difference between gases, but here are some other properties. Hardness is resistance to scratching. Diamonds are the hardest substance on the earth. And you can read the rest of those definitions and write them down as you need to. If you need to pause the video, you may pause the video. Here are some more properties. Some properties of liquids. Talk about density. with any of the states of matter, but we could talk about buoyancy, which is a measure of the upward pressure a fluid exerts on the object. The Archimedes principle says that the force exerted on an object in a liquid is equal to the weight of the fluid displaced by the object, which is something that we usually experiment with in IPC. Viscosity we've already talked about. Properties of gases. Gases can also have buoyancy, and we're going to explore these in great detail later. Charles pressure, atmospheric pressure, and Boyle's law. The big thing you need to know with gases right now is that they are compressible and all the other properties that we talked about.